Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A big welcome for this third webinar organized by the platform Biology about the underrepresentation of women in science. I'm Romain Jean, and the theme of our today's discussion is very, very interesting: the biological differences between men and women. And to introduce the theme, I have the pleasure to give the floor to Didier Picard from the organizing committee. Please, Didier.
Yes, thank you very much, Romain Jean. As we were preparing this series of webinars, it became very clear to us that beyond discussing the numerous cultural constraints impacting women's careers, we had to include a webinar on the neurobiological differences. After all, we are a work group of scientists of the Swiss Academy of Natural Sciences. There's no doubt that gender, as opposed to sex, is culturally constructed, or at least strongly influenced by culture. But this should not mislead us to think that men and women, beyond their reproductive functions, are biologically identical, that there are no innate differences. Studying these and making us aware of these should not lead to judgments of value, but assuming men and women are identical, biologically speaking, does a disservice to both men and women. Thus, it is clearly in the interest of women that their biology, in a broad sense, is taken into account in medicine, psychiatry, and psychology, and yet other disciplines. So today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Professors Larry Cahill of the University of California at Irvine and Jill Becker of the University of Michigan. They are two scientific leaders in this field who are also committed to bringing the science closer to decision makers and the public. And so with this introduction, I hand back to Romain Jean.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Didier Picard. We have heard last week Professor Anna Wall from the Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden saying that gender is socially, culturally constructed, but either biological differences that have an impact on gender equality issues. We have two great speakers, said Professor Larry Cahill and Jill Becker. Let's open the floor with Larry Cahill. Good afternoon. I think it's very early. Good morning. You're in California.
Yes. Good morning, everybody. Welcome from California, where it's bright and early here. I have my coffee to get me going.
Yeah, it's very early, that's sure. Professor Larry Cahill is neuroscientist. His main interest is in how sex influences the brain and body, to understanding sex influences in the specific domain of emotional memory. We are very interesting. The floor is yours, Professor.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much to the organizers for allowing me to participate. It's really a pleasure. I'm going to see if we can, if I share screen here, you can see my slides. I hope now everybody can see my slides. I have 15 minutes to try and capture this topic from a neuroscience perspective. And so that's what I'm going to try and do. I like to start off my talks by asking the question of the audience: are males and females the same or different? And I like to have people think about that for a minute, and I give you my answer, which is yes. I think it is now abundantly clear from a neuroscience perspective that males and females are both the same or similar in many respects, and different a little to a lot in other respects. And it's the different part that has been historically not studied, not believed by neuroscience. And that's the part that I will spend the next roughly 15 minutes talking about. This is a talk in which I envision it having 4 parts. I'm going to start out by offering just a brief background for everyone watching on who I am and what I've studied and how I get into this. Then I'll segue into what I think is the heart of the talk, trying to capture for you just why sex matters for neuroscience, why it's become such an important topic, and how dramatic is the change that's taking place in neuroscience. Then if I have some time, I'll get into, I hope I'll have some time to get into why the resistance to this topic. I think in order to understand why it hasn't moved yet center stage where it belongs, although it is moving there, it's helpful to understand what is it that's kept it from moving center stage where I think it belongs. And then I was asked to offer some thoughts, this being a conference on gender diversity in the sciences, on how all this might apply to that topic. And I will hopefully have some time to do that. Just to cut to the chase there, my view on that, having been dealing with this topic of sex differences in the brain for about 20 years now, my main thought is if one wants to increase gender diversity and equality, the first thing one needs to do is to stop denying that gender diversity exists, by which I mean differences between males and females that are at least partially biologically based. And related to that, in my opinion, one needs to stop equating gender equality with gender sameness. And I'll hopefully have some time to unpack those more near the end. So first, the background.
Larry, if I can interrupt you for a second, I think it would be nice if you could launch the slide as a slideshow.
Yes, I did that. My entire computer will go black.
Ah, okay. I'm sorry. Okay.
I'm afraid it's not an option.
Okay, don't do it then.
I forgot
Yes?
to say that the audience can, as usual, participate, ask questions. They have a Q&A application on the screen, and if you have questions, let's go, and I will take it and for our guest today. Thank you. You can go on.
Okay. So just quickly by way of background, I have studied emotion and memory for about 30 years. From a neuroscience perspective, when you talk about that, there's a structure called the amygdala, which is critical for emotional memory, everyone agrees. And it's a structure that seems to operate by interacting with the body's stress hormones to modulate memory. So that's the basic idea I've worked with for about 30 years on how it is that we make emotional memories. It's a research that's heavily anchored in animal research, much of it on male animals. And I'll come back to why it has been all males. Well, about 25 years ago, I decided to see whether or not this view of emotional memory derived from studies in animals was true in humans. And I started to do that doing things like PET scan and fMRI studies. But when I started to study humans, and this would have been in the early 90s, I started for the first time in my career to study this thing called the female. I had never studied female animals before, so or female humans. And so when I started to take my research to humans and started to include both males and females, I discovered this. I discovered a sex difference or a sex influence on the role of the amygdala in emotional memory, such that it was the amygdala in the right hemisphere of the brain that seemed to be more important for emotional memory in men, and the amygdala in the left hemisphere of the brain that seemed to be more important for emotional memory in women. I discovered this in about 2001, and it changed everything for me. Naturally, I had this question, which was raised by this finding. What does this mean for how women on average and men on average remember emotional things? But what this did was it launched me into the broader topic of sex differences or sex influences on brain function. And I started to become an advocate, essentially, for neuroscience to start to understand and explore sex influences on the brain. Now, for anyone listening, to understand how dramatic is the change that is taking place in neuroscience on this topic, you need to understand where almost all of us were for decades, what we thought sex differences in the brain meant for decades. And you can see it here in a paper from 1966 entitled Sex Differences in the Brain. If you read this entire paper, you will see one and only one brain region mentioned, a structure called the hypothalamus, little tiny structure at the base of your brain that everyone already knew was important for sex behaviors and sex hormones. Whole generations of neuroscientists, like in the 60s, 70s, 80s, were trained to believe that sex differences in the brain simply meant a few tiny, really one tiny little structure at the base of the brain. Sex behaviors, sex hormones stop. That was it. There wasn't any sex influences anywhere else in the brain, as far as the vast majority of us were concerned. Well, it turns out that that couldn't be more wrong. And the reality is that, as I'll try and capture a little bit for you in my talk, and as I'm sure Jill will help capture for you, there's sex influences everywhere at all levels of brain function, from the intact functioning human down to the level of single neurons in petri dishes. There are sex influences on how neurons cultured in petri dishes operate. If you'd like to learn more about this, there's many ways you can, and one is the January 2017 issue of the Journal of Neuroscience Research. It has 70 papers spanning the neuroscience spectrum, all open access. So if you want to learn more about this topic, that's a great resource to start with. I want to highlight the importance of the topic for neuroscience by talking about the work of really just two people. I can give you literally thousands of examples of why sex matters for neuroscience. I'm going to give two. The first is from a well-known investigator, Tracy Shores at Rutgers. And Tracy, like Jill, was into this topic and understood its importance well before the rest of us understood it. And Tracy, for example, was interested in part of the brain that you've probably heard of called the hippocampus and how it functions. And she was interested in the effects of stress on the hippocampus. So she stressed male and female rats, and then she took a look at the structure of their hippocampus, in particular, little parts of neurons called spines, little things that stick off of the neurons and through which neurons talk to one another. And to cut to the chase, Tracy found that stress was increasing the number of spines in the male animals, but the same stress was decreasing the number of spines in the female animals. Now, we think of the spines as points of contact, which should be helpful in, say, learning and memory. So Tracy went on to show something similar happening when she trained the animals, to train them to learn something, Pavlovian conditioning. She found, again, a striking sex difference in the effects of stress on learning, such that the stress was enhancing learning in the male animals, but impairing learning in the female animals. This is rats now. So here we have a striking sex difference in the relationship between stress, structure of neurons, and memory. And this was now at least 20 years ago that Tracy found this. Much more recently, the second example I want to give you comes from another excellent investigator, Catherine Woolley at Northwestern. Catherine, for many years, has been one of the leaders on estrogen functions in the hippocampus. But only recently has gotten more explicitly interested in the differences between the males and the females. And it happened because her lab uncovered some striking sex differences, again, in the hippocampus. And the one I want to tell you about here has to do with something called endocannabinoids, or your body's own marijuana, right? Your neurons contain endocannabinoids. And Catherine wanted to know how these affect the function of the hippocampus, in particular, how it affects the ability of two neurons to talk to each other. And again, to cut to the chase, Catherine found that, first of all, in her field, it was well known that these endocannabinoids do not affect one aspect of hippocampal function, the talking of two neurons to each other. And it was well known because everyone had looked for effects of endocannabinoids on this function and nobody found it. Well, Catherine in her lab found that there was an effect of endocannabinoids on the ability of the neurons to communicate with each other. And she was surprised at this initially. And then she realized that her study had, for accidental reasons, used females, and all the previous studies had used males. So what Catherine stumbled upon was a striking sex difference in the ability of endocannabinoids to affect the hippocampal function, such that it was affecting hippocampal function in the females, and it was not affecting hippocampal function in the males. Now, these are only two examples, but it gets to what I think is my most important take-home message. Sex influences are everywhere on brain function. Neuroscience has now shown that beyond question using animal research. And then I'd like to point out that because of this immense body of animal research, we can now say, we can be 100% confident that the human brain contains all manner of sex influences at all levels of its function, down to the genetic foundation, without ever discussing a single study involving human subjects. I think most people don't stop to think of it that way. Or put another way, the question of whether the human mammalian brain is a highly sex-influenced organ has been settled by animal research. Okay, and that again is probably the main thing I want to tell you, and I'm 10 minutes into this talk. Because of all this research, which I'm just giving you 2 examples of, and well, 3 if we count my own, several years ago, the National Institute of America decided, you know, we need to stop studying overwhelmingly males, stop assuming that there aren't sex differences in brain and body, and start assuming that there are, and we need to understand them. And so, boy, I hope I don't lose my internet connection here. That would be bad. So they passed this sex as a biological variable resolution, which is just a wonderful corner that we turned. We will not be going back to studying only males and assuming that we're equally understanding females when we do. We did overwhelm referring to was we didn't believe that there were sex differences outside of a few tiny little areas related to reproduction. And now, as I say, as I hope I've captured for you, there are sequences throughout the brain. Okay, I have a few minutes left. I'm going to just try and quickly capture why the resistance. I'm not sure this is worth doing so quickly, but I'll try. The first thing is that, again, I think the main reason that there was resistance is this widespread belief that fundamental sex differences outside reproductive function simply don't exist. And I've had many people tell me over the years that they would be interested in sex differences, except they want to understand fundamental things first. So you can see that comment indicates that people really didn't believe that sex differences were all that important or fundamental. The next reason, and it's ironic, by the way, that people have been avoiding sex differences because, as you may know, we've had a lot of talk in recent years about the need for individualized or personalized medicine. And you might think that sex differences would be leading that charge, but it really hasn't been. A lot of the same people who will tell you that it's very important to study personalized medicine, individual differences, a lot of the same people will tell you, well, you don't really need to pay attention to one of the most fundamental of individual differences, whether or not one is female or male. The other source of resistance, just to mention briefly to this topic, has been, I think, not scientific, but political. And that is captured in this phrase neurosexist. I have been called a neurosexist because I'm interested in what Mother Nature thinks about sex influences in the brain. And I think rather than get into that too much more, since I'm running out of time, I'll just leave it at that. There is a lot of talk about male and female and whether or not we should be talking about male and female. There's an enormous amount of resistance to this topic that I believe is, again, more political than scientific. And my own view, after having dealt with this for about 20 years, is that this resistance is heavily anchored in a false assumption. The assumption that if men and women are going to be equal, then men and women have to be the same. I believe that is false, but I think it is my view is that men and women are dead on equal and not the same on average. And that if we want to do things like increase gender diversity in the workplace, it behooves us to pay attention and respect the differences between the males and females, no matter how much they are biologically based or culturally based or an interaction of those two. I believe it is the denial of the different part, which is ongoing, which is especially hard, problematic for women. That is my take on it. And I think I'm at the 15-minute mark at this point, if I'm not mistaken. And I don't want to drone on long. So I think what I'll do is I'll skip to the very end here, where I quote Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who said in a landmark decision, "Inherent differences between men and women we have come to appreciate remain cause for celebration." That's what I think. And I think to really help improve the situation of women in the workplace, we need to acknowledge and respect and understand the differences and not pretend they don't exist. I emphasize this because for 20 years, I've been dealing with people who want to pretend that the differences don't exist. So with that, I will end. I will say thank you very much. Are males and females the same or different? My answer is yes. The idea of sex differences is an issue that I believe one whose time has come. And with that, I will stop and say thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Cahill. So there is biological differences between men and women. I have perhaps a first question. Do you think that denying these differences harms women?
Do I think that denying the differences is what?
It's bad for the woman. It's that it harms the woman.
Yes, absolutely.
In
right.
what way?
Well, the main way, which most neuroscientists have focused on, is in healthcare, right? So if it, to the extent that males and females truly differ in whatever aspect of biological function, brain, body, whatever, to the extent that they do differ, but we pretend that they don't, we continue to have a science overwhelmingly based on the male, that's the exact extent to which this must harm women. That's an argument that I have been making and others for 20 years or over 20 years in the case of people like Jill and Tracy Shores. So I think it's very clear that in the context of brain dysfunction or medical treatment, it simply has to be the case. As we've been doing for years, has to proportionately harm women. And you see that, for example, when you look at, for example, side effects of drugs. Many studies now have shown that as a rule, women are twice as likely to get various side effects of drugs as men are. That's exactly what should happen in a science that is based on males, if in fact sex differences are real. When we step out of now the medical domain into the healthy brain function, in my opinion, is the same logic must apply, although it's often harder to see exactly how it does. But to the extent that males and females operate differently in the workplace for whatever combination of biological / cultural reasons, or in their interests, in their goals, in their motivations, to the extent that we deny those differences and continue to operate on a system heavily based on the male, it's the same as in the medical situation. Seems to me that has to disproportionately harm females.
Mm-hmm. We have a question. Can Professor Cahill give us a perspective on how large the role of nurture, environment, upbringing, etc., could be in the sex differences found in humans?
So how large is the role of nurture?
Yeah, nurture, environment, upbringing, etc.
Yeah, so I think that for virtually everything in the human, there's going to be the interplay of the biological substrate, right, and the experience as a general statement. That has to happen, and there are plenty of examples of nurture, as we're calling it, influencing the outcomes of various experiments. No question about that. At the same time, the biological foundation, as a general statement, constrains what the nurture can do. If you think about it, the whatever experience you find yourself thrown into, that can't make your biology do things that your biology can't do, right? And so the way I view it is there's a biological substrate that we struggle as neuroscientists to understand. That biological substrate is going to interact with whatever conditions a person finds themselves in. to produce the final outcome, but the biological substrate is going to constrain what the experiences can do, right? Experiences can, again, to repeating myself, but experiences can't make the biology do things that the biology can't do. We see this really nicely illustrated in some work on, there was a sociologist named Richard Udry, who did some wonderful work looking at the interaction between a woman's biological substrate, and in particular, how much she was exposed to testosterone in utero, and her cultural experience, her nurture in
the sound is not very good. It's interrupted. Are you with us?
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm very sorry about that. I hope you can hear me. It's a long answer. Let me cut it to the chase.
Yeah.
Nature and nurture are going to be interacting in humans, but it is not the case that nurture can cause nature to do anything. That's not the case. So the nature in some ways must constrain the nurture. That's a short answer to the same question.
Mm-hmm. We have another question. Is a dichotomy in the brains between sex really clear? Or did you see more like a continuum between individuals with overlap between some women and some men?
Yeah, so in most of these findings that we have, these are average differences, just like the rest of biology. So that there are cases where the differences that are seen are non-overlapping in some experiments, in some situations. But in most situations, the differences you find are average differences. I like to use the example of there is an average difference between men and women in height, but they are two overlapping populations. The idea of a continuum that's a big thing. It's an idea that we're seeing a lot now from some corners of the field, and essentially what certain people are advocating is an idea that there aren't really male and female populations. There's just one population with a continuum between them. That is not true. That is an idea that if you take a look at if you look at just some tiny little pieces of the evidence, you can start to view sex differences in this continuum fashion. But if you take a look at all the evidence, including the genetic substrate, it is not the case that the males and females essentially will boil down to one population. They will end up being two populations, overlapping in many respects, but not a single population.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have a lot of questions. Please, if you can answer very shortly to the last one after you stay with us, naturally. Alexandra asked, aren't you afraid that strongly highlighting the difference between sexes will be misunderstood with opinion one is better than the other? After all, people love to compare each other.
So I've been hearing that comment for about 20 years. And there's, I don't know what to say. We don't avoid scientific truth because it might be misused by someone. That's not what we do as scientists. So, by that logic, we shouldn't study genetics because genetics have been massively misused, right? So I don't agree with the view that we should avoid scientific truth because someone might do something that we don't like with it. Yeah.
Okay. You stay with us. It's time to listen to the presentation of Jill Becker. Thank you very much. Jill Becker is a psychological researcher studying sex difference in addiction. She holds a chair in biopsychology at Michigan University in USA. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you for asking me to be a part of this. Larry is a very hard act to follow, so I hope you will bear with me. And I'm going to tell you sort of a view from above. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty. I'm really glad that he gave the examples of Tracy Shores and Catherine Woolley, because they're good examples that I can use as I describe how it is that the brains of individuals, males and female mammals, come to be different. And that is that the chromosomal sex, if you have 2X chromosomes, then you get ovaries. And in the absence of hormones, because the ovary is basically quiescent during the prenatal, perinatal period, the brain, at least the hypothalamus that Larry referred to, becomes female. On the other hand, if you have a Y chromosome, then on the Y chromosome is an SRY gene, and that gene causes the bipotential gonad to become a testes. The testes make testosterone, which gets to the brain, and in the brain of rodents is converted by the enzyme aromatase to become estradiol. In humans, it seems that testosterone is masculinizing the brain itself. And most of what we know about sexual differentiation of the brain has focused on the hypothalamus, as Larry mentioned. And so these fundamental mechanisms we know are true in the hypothalamus, but when it gets to other areas of the brain, it's not quite as clear. Now, as Larry was alluding to by his discussion of sex differences, there is a female typical brain and a male typical brain, but I would argue that it's not a simple bimodal process, because you have the action of gonadal hormones acting on the brain during this perinatal period of development, which is considered a critical period. And then you have hormones acting again during the peripubertal period, when the fetal ovary becomes active and produces estradiol and progesterone in a cyclic manner, and the testes become active and produce testosterone. So again, you can have hormonal influences during puberty that result in more permanent changes in the brain. And then, as some of the questions were asking.
Excuse me, may I ask you to share with us your slides? I think you had slides.
Oh,
we can't see.
I'm so sorry. I thought I was sharing.
You put it on your screen. On your screen, yes. Thank you very much.
Can I start over?
No, you can go on, but just yeah. Very good.
Sorry. Okay. I'm sorry. I can't believe I did that, and I have to go back.
But it was perfect. I think you can go on.
Okay, but I can't see it.
We see not a simple bimodal process. We are on this slide.
Okay, and you have the full screen?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that good still?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
My apologies. Okay.
No, you're on the wrong screen, because we see the presenter mode.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Perfect.
I'm just gonna back up to this slide before, if you don't mind. Just so you know that the hormones are acting from the ovary and the testes to act on the brain. It's not a simple bimodal process, which is to say you have, there is a continuum. I agree with Larry that there are some aspects that you will see primarily in females, because the biological foundation on which these hormones and environmental events are acting is constrained by the biology, but it's not the case that you will always see certain traits in females only, or only in males. The environmental events can also be acting on these, the brain as it develops. And that means, for example, stress that happens during the prenatal period tends to have greater effects on men than on women, and stress that happens during the adolescent period tends to affect women more than men. And while we tend to talk about sex differences as being males and females, and this says behavior, but it could be any kind of trait, there are many different types of sex differences, and these are not mutually exclusive categories, so that male typical sex behavior is qualitatively different from female sex behavior, but there are also certain traits that are quantitatively different. They can be measured on the same scale. So for example, if you give a female rat amphetamine and a male rat the same dose of amphetamine, you will see a greater behavioral response in the female compared to the male. So that's a quantitative difference. There are also population differences, which is to say there are certain events, and I think, for example, stress during development can push population differences towards more females having the trait or more males having the trait, where if you were to look at the distribution of the occurrence of the trait in males versus females, you would see that more females tended to be at one end of the distribution than males. And so these could be things like, for example, when I give female and male rats a choice of cocaine versus pellets, more females choose cocaine than males do. And yet when we look at changes in the brain associated with the choice of cocaine, we see so far that the changes are the same changes that are occurring in the nucleus accumbens. It's just that more females are exhibiting those traits. Finally, both of the types of differences that Catherine Woolley and Tracy Shores talked about, where if you manipulate the system, you see that the underlying mechanisms responding are different, are what Catherine Woolley refers to as latent sex differences, which is to say both males and females show a stress response, but the neural mechanisms mediating that response are different. So that's a latent sex difference. And these are not exclusive differences. They can happen in various, at the same time in various animals. Okay, so one of the things that I think has held back the study of sex as a biological variable is the idea that females are more variable than males. And so throughout my career, when I've asked, have you looked at females in your research, they've always said, well, I can't do it because of females are more variable and I don't want to deal with the estrus cycle. So Brian Prendergast and Zheng Lang and I looked at 326 neuroscience articles that had both males and females in them. And we measured the mean and the standard deviation in each of the pieces of data contained within these articles. And we looked at behavioral traits, we looked at electrophysiology, we looked at histology, we looked at neurochemistry, and things like non-brain measures were blood levels of hormone, organ levels, stuff like that. And what we saw is that female rats are not more variable than male rats. If you look at the, if you add the male and the female means together and then divide by the male, you'll get this CV ratio. And what that shows you is sort of the distribution between males and females. And what you see is that for neurochemistry and electrophysiology, in fact, the distribution is such that males are more variable than females are. And so it's not variability which should be limiting the study of females. Annalise Berry published this recently in COPS, and what she showed is that female rats are being excluded from biomedical research. Only 25% mice, only 25% of studies using mice included both sexes, and only 5% analyzed by sex. And yet, if you look at the variance using the same type of analysis that I did in my paper, what you see is that males are slightly more variable than females are when you look at the number of traits in which there is a male biased increase in standard deviation. So there's really no methodological reason that females should not be included in biomedical research. And as Larry was mentioning, it's these biases in studying males over females that have led to a lack of knowledge about women's health. And that's why it's detrimental to our understanding of even mental health disorders, when anxiety disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder are greater in women than in men, and yet all of the subjects looking at biology have been in males. It's hard to understand. It's hard to not understand why we're not making progress there are also disorders where males are dominant. These tend to be developmental disorders. The other thing is, at least in my career, because I've been studying sex differences since I was doing my PhD in the late 70s. And let me say that when people don't think that sex differences are important, it can be detrimental to women's careers if you are proposing to study sex differences. And as one of the founders of the Organization for the Study of Sex Differences, which at least when we formed it was predominantly female, it's hard not to think that not including females as an important consideration in research is detrimental to the careers of women, because it is a fundamental process. In my research, what I study is sex differences in drug abuse and addiction, and I focus on cocaine primarily. I'm not going to give you any data. I'm just wanted to mention that it's not just demographics. Even though more men than women are addicted to alcohol and cocaine, the time from exposure to chronic drug use is shorter for women than men. Women, present for treatment consuming more drug than men. And women report their reasons for initiating drug use is primarily to self-medicate for anxiety, stress, and depression. Disorders that I just showed you are more prevalent in women than in men. So learning about how sex differences in the brain are impacting our behavior is important for understanding the processes of addiction. And if we look at the different classes of drugs, this is just a summary. I'm not going to go through it, but it just points out that we have qualitative, quantitative, and population differences with all aspects of the addiction process, from initiation of drug taking to escalation to side effects on withdrawal and the craving. And the same processes are present in humans, with escalation of drug use being greater in females than in males, and showing both qualitative, quantitative, and population differences in different aspects of drug use. So as I think about sex differences, and as I encourage you to think about sex differences, you don't think of it simply as being a bimodal process where all males are like this or all females are like this. There are many different ways that males and females can differ. And this is important for the science, but also for thinking about how sex is impacting the leaky pipeline. So how can my research results be used to help fix the leaky pipeline? I was asked to answer this question, and I'm giving you very similar answers to the answers that Larry gave. So sex differences in the brain are biological, and it's important to understand these differences for our understanding of women's health and for our understanding of the neurobiological mechanisms mediating function in the brain. And I agree with Larry. These sex differences are to be embraced and not ignored. This is not neurosexism. It is true that Broca studied the brains of males and females in order to prove that the smaller size of the female brain meant that they shouldn't be educated. But we need to move beyond these previous sexist attempts to look at the brain and use it to understand that sex differences are an important type of diversity. And women need to be supported for bringing different perspectives, which are likely mediated by sex differences in the brain impacted by gender influences or cultural influences, because it is a type of diversity that women bring to the academy that is important. When I started my lab, I had always had male mentors previously. I tried to use a hierarchical organization of my laboratory. It didn't work for me. I have a much more collaborative approach. When I realized that and used the approach that was normal and comfortable to me, I was able to have a functioning and healthy research lab. And finally, I'm going to say that sexual harassment in the lab, whether you're criticizing someone for studying sex differences or just from the study or just studying females to microaggressions and sexual misconduct is just not acceptable. And all of this is important for sex differences in the brain because women are impacted by these things much more strongly. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you. This is my laboratory before the pandemic. We look pretty much like the same now, but the undergraduates have changed. So thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Jill Becker. Thank you very much. We have a question for you and for Professor Larry too. So sex differences in the brain are biological. We have a question. How can we prevent that people misuse? The same question as before. How can we prevent that people misuse studies about sex differences to discriminate against a certain sex? What is your opinion?
So my opinion is that it is a fundamental nature for people to try to have this critical view that one is better than the other. But that's what we do as members of the academy. We have to make sure that we don't allow these criticisms to have any credence. We have to point out, that we wouldn't allow people to criticize individuals who had darker skin because of their darker skin anymore. That's not considered acceptable. It should also not be acceptable to criticize individuals because of their sex and the fact that their brains might be different.
Mm-hmm. You said on your slide that women need to be supported for bringing different perspectives and approach to the academy. How can we do that?
By encouraging their voices to be heard. And I think you're going to be hearing, as you proceed through this seminar series, more ways that can be done. The idea that you have implicit biases that are always part of what you do. You have to make sure that you acknowledge your implicit biases and then rise above them. That's what we do in search committees. Before we start looking at candidates, we say, recognize that there is an implicit bias, and we need to be looking at these with the lens of not considering that bias.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from Kathleen. How well can modern neuroscience tell the difference between the outcomes of biological constraints versus early I don't see the versus, my screen is moving, versus early nurturing experiences. The difference between biological constraint and nurturing experience.
They work together. I mean, the nurturance experience is going to be acting on the biological substrate. It will enhance certain aspects of development if you have a enriched environment and good nutrition, and it can depress development if you have decreased nutrition and an impoverished environment. And it will impact males and females in slightly different ways, which has been shown experimentally, because the brains of males and females on which these events are acting are different.
Mm-hmm. We have a question again for Professor Cahill. On a more political view, does he think that equality of outcome, for example, parity in every type of jobs, is achievable and even desirable?
Make sure I understood the question. Do I think that equality of outcome is achievable or even desirable?
Yeah.
If by equality of outcome one means, I went over these slides very quickly, but a given profession has 50-50 women, men. I assume that's what the questioner means by equality of outcome. It may be achievable, in a given profession, in my opinion, but the question is at what cost? And then the question would then be, is that cost worth it? So one of the slides I flew over, because I made a junior mistake and tried to pack in way too much in a 15-minute talk. I should know better by now. But one of the things that I flew over was a slide showing that in the field of plumbing, there are only 1.5% women. Basically, plumbers are male. You'll have a hard time finding a female plumber. Now, would you like equality of outcome? And the field of plumbing, of course, is immensely important for society, right? We're all shut down without plumbing. So you could achieve equality of outcome where 50% of the plumbers were women. I imagine you could do that. It would be probably pretty draconian to make that happen. But the question is that worth it? And which relates to the question, is there something inherently wrong with not having 50% female plumbers? My answer is no, there's nothing inherently wrong with it. If women don't want to go into plumbing, that's fine, for whatever combination of biological / cultural reasons. Bear in mind, for example, that women, neither Jill nor I talked about this because there's so much we can't talk about, but women have often extraordinarily better senses of smell and much higher levels of disgust than do men. So put those two together and ask yourself the question, should 50% of all plumbers be women? If you want equality of outcome, and if that's your goal, equality of outcome, then your answer is yes, 50% of all plumbers should be women, no matter the cost. My answer to that question is therefore, yeah, you can get equality of outcome in a given situation, but you'd have to determine honestly whether or not it's worth it.
What do you think, Professor Jill Becker, about this topic, about this point? What is your opinion?
Sorry, it was, I don't know that you always want equality of, I'm sorry, could you rephrase the question? Because I'm I got confused by Larry's answer.
The question was, are the same salary? Is it? Do we have to have the same salary between men and women, for example? Is it okay for you, or it's not desirable?
Yes, I think we need to have the same salary for men and women, especially when it comes to jobs that men and women do equally well. And when we're talking about professorial roles, I think men and women should be paid the same amount. Certainly that's true at the University of Michigan. There's been a strong push for the last 20 years to make sure that there's equality of salary when it comes to being at the same level with the same experience.
Mm-hmm.
I should add, while I'm here, that the questioner did not ask the question about salary. I certainly would agree. I don't see how you disagree with the argument that males and females should get the same salary for doing the same work. I don't see how you disagree with that.
Mm-hmm. Jill Becker, perhaps the last question. The topic of this webinar are the underrepresentation of women in science. You said that there are biological differences between women and men. And what kind of conclusion can we draw for the field that we are interested in? It means underrepresentation of women. What is the link between both?
So the point I was trying to make in talking about the different types of sex differences that you can see in the brain and in behavior is that just because there are all of these different types of differences doesn't mean there should be sex differences in representation of women in the academy. And the leaky pipeline, in my opinion, is not due to sex differences in the brain. It's due to sex differences in the way that women are treated and the way that women are expected to be just like men when they're not. And they should be allowed to approach the roles that they are taking with their own perspectives and not expected to be just like men. The outcome and the ability to do the research is the same. We see that in our graduate students. They are brilliant. We're 60% women in graduate school, and they are brilliant women, and yet they don't stay in the profession because we don't make it easy for them to. And we should be looking at ways to increase the brilliance in our academy by keeping those women part of the professoriate. I mean, it's just wrong that we don't find ways to make that better.
So Jill, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure. I wanted to ask some questions.
I find this very interesting. I'm a participant now, not a speaker. But when you say we don't make it easy for the women graduate students, postdocs, what specifically do you mean, and what specifically are the sort of the top things, you know, we could or should change?
So I've been running workshops at the University of Michigan in the neuroscience program, trying to emphasize that microaggressions, sexual harassment in the laboratory happens in graduate school, it happens in postdocs, and the women I talk to who drop out before they even apply for a professor job, that is one of the #1 problems we have in the academy, is sexual harassment. So we don't make it easy because men and even some women will say little things like, oh, you're just going to have babies, or you don't really want to do this. And that tends to decrease women's likelihood of staying in academia and contributing to science and staying in science even. We don't make it easy for women to have babies and still be in the professoriate. We need to be better at that. And we don't make it easy for women to approach the role with their own perspectives rather than doing it the way that men have done it for all these years. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Are you agreeing, Professor Larry Cahill?
Yeah, we are on the exact same page. I mean, the exact same page. We're saying, look, stop making women succeed by being men, which is another way of saying, acknowledge the damn differences and quit denying them. And no matter the degree to which they are biologically / culturally based, or the interaction of those two, stop it and allow women. I flew over some slides where I had Melinda Gates amongst others saying women should be free to act like women and not men. This is on the assumption that women are different from men in some important ways. But this idea is anathema to many people that women and men differ. And notice in my slide, I said, are males and females the same or different? I said, yes, by which I meant they're the same in a lot of ways, but they're different. And so I'm on the exact same page as Jill. Stop denying the different part. Stop demonizing people for even suggesting there's a different part, and start acknowledging and working with it if you really want to help women.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Larry Cahill. Thank you, Jill Becker, for this lively debate, interesting discussion. Thank you very much. We're at the end of this hour. We have still 6 more webinars. We have heard that ignoring significant influences of sex should they exist can only retard progress in gender equality. Our next meeting is programmed on October 11, and it's about the gender equality paradox. Differences between men and women tend to grow as countries become more developed and gender equal. This is the paradox. So you can see again this webinar on YouTube, and thank you very much for your interest. Thank you to our guests, and see you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.